Hi, third graders. I wanted to share another chapter from Leprechauns Don't Play Basketball by Debbie Dady and Marcia Thornton Jones. We are going to be reading chapter 6 today. Before we start chapter 6, let's review chapter 5. We're noticing some things about the characters from their actions and words. I'm noticing that Melody and Howie are both observant because they're noticing things about Mr. O'Grady. For instance, he doesn't ever look anybody in the eyes. He looks at their nose instead. Liza seems to be kind of funny in the way that she acts. Eddie also seems to want to act brave in front of his friends. He also lies to Mrs. Jeepers, so it shows that he's kind of going along with the character traits that he has portrayed so far. Mrs. Jeepers also seems to be afraid of Mr. O'Grady, so I wonder what that is all about. We'll have to think about that as we read some of the next chapters. A summary of chapter 5 we can use the somebody wanted but so then model. So previously in Leprechauns Don't Play Basketball, Liza and her friends were disappointed. They wanted to celebrate St. Patrick's Day by making shamrocks in Mrs. Jeepers' third grade classroom. But Eddie explains Mrs. Jeepers hates leprechauns and doesn't want anything to do with St. Patrick's Day. They start to think Mr. O'Grady may be a leprechaun. So Howie decides to ask his grandmother what she knows about leprechauns since she was from Ireland. Then Mrs. Japers acts strangely when the group tells her about Mr. O'Grady, and Howie thinks there is going to be trouble. So let's find out what happens in chapter 6. The title of chapter 6 is Stairway to the Emerald Isle. Now I know the Emerald Isle is another name for Ireland. So I'm wondering, is this the way to Ireland? Are they going to be going to Ireland? What does this chapter title mean? Chapter 6, Stairway to the Emerald Isle. That afternoon, the 4 kids met under the oak tree. I wonder why Mrs. Jeepers acted so strange when we told her about Mr. O'Grady, Melody asked. Maybe he's her long-lost husband, Liza said wistfully. But she acted scared, Eddie reminded them. Maybe her long-lost husband is an axe murderer, Melody giggled nervously. But Mrs. Jeepers said her husband was dead, Howie pointed out. Maybe Mr. O'Grady's with the Irish CIA, Melody suggested. Mrs. Jeepers might be an international jewel thief. Maybe Mr. O'Grady really is a leprechaun, Liza said softly. You know Mrs. Jeepers doesn't like them. Why don't you guys come home with me for a few minutes? Howie suggested. My grandmother knows all about Ireland. I'm sure she can tell us about leprechauns. She'll know why Mrs. Jeepers is afraid of them. Guess it'd be okay, just for a minute, Melody said. Everyone else nodded and headed toward Howie's house. It didn't take long for the 4 friends to walk the 3 blocks. They dumped their book bags in the front hall and found Howie's grandmother in the family room, reading the newspaper. Her curly gray hair danced around her head, and her eyes sparkled like blue sapphires. Are you picturing what she looks like? Well, Howie, his grandmother smiled and put down her newspaper. You look to be bringing half the school home with you. Howie introduced Melody, Liza, and Eddie. He was barely finished when Eddie blurted, We need to know about leprechauns. Howie's grandmother's smile faded, but just for a moment. So, St. Patrick's Day has you wondering about the little fairy folk. 'Tis a good thing to talk about on this fine day. His grandmother's voice tinkled with the same accent as Mr. O'Grady's. Treat yourselves to some cookies, and I'll be a-telling you some leprechaun tales. The kids helped themselves to a handful of cookies from the kitchen, and then settled down to listen. Once upon a time in Ireland, Howie's grandmother began. Oh, Grandma, Howie interrupted, we have to have the true story of leprechauns. Melody nodded. Our teacher wouldn't tell us a thing. Mrs. Jeepers acted very strange today, Howie explained. She's from Romania. Well, I'm looking at the picture. And I'm looking at Howie's grandmother and her curly hair. I'm also noticing how the kids are gathered around her to listen to the story, but they seem to have some worried expressions on their face, like they're really very interested in what's going on with this leprechaun story. And she won't even talk about leprechauns. Howie's grandmother frowned. Saints preserve us, she said quietly. Leprechauns are a most peculiar fairy folk. Most people don't know the true history of their race. But they're just cute little men who wear green and hide pots of gold at the end of rainbows, Liza said. Ah, truth is, a rainbow doesn't lead only to a pot of gold, Howie's grandmother whispered. A rainbow is also a leprechaun's stairway to the Emerald Isle. Now that's the title of the chapter. So the rainbow is a leprechaun's stairway to the Emerald Isle. I wonder what that means. What's the Emerald Isle? Melody asked. "'Tis another name for Ireland," Howie's grandmother explained. "Settle back and I'll be a-tellin' you the true story of the wee folk." The four kids sat on the floor and peered up at the old woman. She spoke so quietly they had to lean forward to hear. And that is the end of the chapter. So, some interesting things in this chapter. I don't know if you noticed, but Howie's grandmother stopped smiling when they were asking about the true story of the leprechauns, just like Mrs. Jeepers was a little bit worried about the leprechauns too. So, we'll have to find out more when we read on.